Australia and New Zealand had a version of prohibition just like America did that resulted in violent gang wars a la Al Capone. It was a little bit different for them though, as there were still legal alcohol vendors. They were just not permitted to sell alcohol past 6 p.m. starting in 1916 mid-World War I. And of course, this restriction still opened an avenue for bootlegging, as many people get off work past 6 p.m. and want to have a drink late at night. In some places, the 6 o'clock swill would not be abolished until 1967. But today I'm going to be talking about the gang activity in Melbourne specifically, which, fun fact, is where my paternal grandmother and her family lived during this time. In some ways, you can compare Melbourne to our Chicago, but really it was a much scaled down version of Chicago, as Australia has never had a comparable population size to the US, and the US had the added benefit of sharing a border with both Canada and Mexico, where beer and other products could be smuggled in. In Australia, you either had to steal from one of those legal liquor stores or brew your own stuff, which they called sly grog, which mainly consisted of brewing beer. So what we called speakeasies in America, they referred to as sly grog shops. And what's interesting about sly grog is that a lot of the time it was brewed by women, schmex workers, or madams to be more specific. Of course, there were also male sly grog brewers, just as there were women also brewing in America, specifically in Appalachia, where brewing rye or corn whiskey was often a family affair. But these women in Melbourne had a camaraderie and shared their recipes amongst each other, as well as warning each other about men to stay away from. And one of the most, if not the most prominent brewer in Melbourne at this time was named Minnie Clark. Minnie was born on April 25th, 1888 in Tasmania to a young unmarried couple, but her mother passed away shortly after giving birth to her. She was adopted into a family who ended up moving to Melbourne, and at a very young age, Minnie began getting into trouble. By 17, she was pregnant out of wedlock by a man who would become her first husband, Philip Burgin. But almost immediately after marrying Philip, Minnie was swept into Melbourne's underworld by significantly older schmex workers / madams who groomed her and introduced her to smoking, drinking, and schmex work herself. And Minnie was often in schmexual relationships with these women and would typically leave her new baby Rupert with neighbors or complete strangers while Philip was at work selling flowers so that she could spend all night partying and working herself. One time, Philip took her on a vacation to Sydney but had to return home earlier than Minnie to go back to work. And when he picked up Minnie at the docks a few days later, she got off the boat without Rupert, saying she left him with some nice people back in Sydney. So Philip had to make an emergency trip to go retrieve their son, which thankfully he was able to do. Obviously, Philip could only handle this behavior for so long, though he really did try very hard to make this marriage work. But one of the final straws was when Minnie went missing for 2 weeks. And then out of the blue, someone notified Philip that she had appeared in court to testify in defense of a man named Edward Campbell Dean. Dean was being charged with burglary, and when Philip arrived, he learned that Minnie had put up Philip's flower shop as collateral to bail Dean out of jail. In Philip's divorce papers, he cited that Minnie was unfaithful and that Dean was one of the people she was having an affair with. Edward Dean would become Minnie's second husband, and their union would be lifelong. She abandoned her son Rupert and entered into a life of crime with Dean instead. Dean had many aliases like most criminals at the time, and the one he became most known for was John Clark, and this last name is the one that Minnie would adopt as well. She might not have chosen his true last name, Dean, because there already existed a very notorious woman named Minnie Dean in New Zealand, and that Minnie Dean was the only woman in New Zealand history to be executed by the state. You'll have to look her up yourself, and fair warning, the crime has to do with babies. Perhaps it was for this reason that Minnie chose to go by her husband's most common alias, Clark. However, for much of their relationship, either Minnie or Dean was in jail. So a lot of the time, one of them had to work independently to support the 2 daughters they eventually had, Edna and Patricia. And Minnie, of course, did this by using her talents as a brewer and brothel manager. And a lot of her time was spent running establishments owned by the gangster and 2-time middleweight Australian boxing champion, Ted Whiting. Minnie was constantly surrounded by very nasty company and was honestly pretty nasty herself at times. But she was a rather big player in this group for being a woman. She was so important, in fact, that she was present all throughout an 8-month gang war that took place between Ted Whiting and another gang leader named Squizzy Taylor. Now, the author uses this photo for Squizzy Taylor, but when I look him up online, they show this photo. He kind of looks like another American heartthrob I know. But anyways, I'm sure the author has the correct photo. The rivalry began because of a jewelry store robbery that Taylor orchestrated and brought Whiting in on in June of 1918. But throughout the rest of that year, Whiting began to learn that Taylor took much more than just half of the riches. And the first shooting in this gang war happened in January 1919 in a brothel that Minnie was operating. But that was nothing compared to what was about to happen. In February 1919, Taylor's wife, Dolly Gray, walked into one of Ted Red Whiting's brothels, also operated by Minnie Clark, decked out in the fanciest, most expensive clothing, and wearing several rings from the jewelry heist that Whiting was shorted on. And Whiting and his men got their revenge on Taylor by assaulting Dolly Gray when she became incapacitated from drinking. All of them. This assault was so bad that Dolly Gray went home, took her daughters, and ran, and remained in hiding for the rest of her life. And when Squizzy Taylor found out what happened, he went absolutely ballistic. For months upon months, there were nightly shootings in the Fitzroy-Melbourne area, and this gang war came to be known as the Fitzroy Vendetta. At least 10 people died throughout this gang war, and Minnie was present for the very first shooting in it, and the very last one, where she herself ended up getting shot right in the forehead. Minnie would survive from being rushed into surgery that night. Towards the late 1920s, Minnie and Edward tried to live a simpler life, but by the time they decided to do that, Minnie's decades of hard living had caught up with her, even though she was only in her late 40s. One day she had to call a taxi because she was having intense heart pain, not knowing that the young driver who came to pick her up would be one of the last people to see her alive. She passed away later that evening on May 3rd, 1937, at just 48 years old. It wouldn't be for another 10 years that her firstborn, Rupert, would decide to look for his long-lost mother, Minnie. He managed to get an address for her, but when he pulled up to her house, he realized it was the same place where he'd picked up a woman a decade prior who was having a heart attack. Rupert was the taxi driver who took Minnie to the hospital that day. At the very last moment, mother and son were reunited. In my next video, I'll be covering a truly mind-blowing portion of Minnie's husband, Edward's life. I've never read a prison break story quite like his. I learned all of this in the book 7246 Minnie by Roy Malloy. Roy is actually my mutual friend on TikTok, and he sent me this book along with his biography on Squizzy Taylor. Check out Roy's page. He does a lot of true crime stuff all throughout Australia and is an Aboriginal filmmaker. He's kind of a jack of all trades. He does a lot of things. Go check out his page, and thank you so much for watching.